This is Mike Console. Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is the podcast where I interview published fiction writers to gather their insights and help make us better at what we do. Thank you for joining me. When I invite people on the podcast as guests, some say yes, obviously, some say no, and some don't say yes or no because I never hear back from them. Recently, though, I got a rejection notice for a very sad reason. I invited a well-known novelist to be a guest on the program, a novelist whose work I've read, and a person I'm going to keep anonymous for reasons you'll understand in a moment. She probably wouldn't even consider herself to be a famous novelist, but if you read fiction widely, or like me, you're in the writing business and are assiduous about keeping up with the business and its players, there's a good chance that you know of her. Let's just say she's semi-famous. So I invite her on the program and had to follow up a time or two to get a reply, which I rarely do, by the way, unless I really want the person to be on the program, which was the case here, that I really wanted her to be on the program. So I followed up a second time and a third time, and she replied with this email message that reads like so. Dear Mike, thank you for your persistence and apologies for taking so long to get back to you. I think I will pass on this. I really haven't written anything in a sustained or satisfactory way in almost 3 years, since I finished the final revisions on my last novel, in fact. So I'm in trouble as a writer, and I don't think it would help me or my writing life to talk in a public forum about that. Thank you for the invitation. I have to say no with a whole variety of regrets. That's the end of the message, other than her signing off with her name. Now, this is an author who has written at least 13 books that I know of. She's written at least 13 books and now has run aground. I mean, what a nightmare that is for a writer. I think it's something we all fear. I really feel for her, and I'm hoping that she's going to have some kind of breakthrough in the near future, and that she comes on the program in the future and tells us about this, harrowing experience she appears to be having, and what it took to reactivate her writing. I'm assuming it's going to come back. I have a hard time seeing her, the author of, again, at least 13 books, suddenly running completely dry. No more stories, no more phrases, no more characters. And, Sting, the famous musician, went through a really dreadful period of writer's block years ago. And he broke out of it. He's told this story many times. He broke out of it by going back to his home, the hometown he grew up in. And he turned to the stories of his childhood. He turned the stories of his childhood into an album, and then even a show on Broadway. And the stories are all based on the people he knew, who he grew up around in northern England, in a town called Wallsend, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Wallsend, Wallsend. And by Sting's telling of it, he grew up in a town that was really dedicated to shipbuilding. At the end of his street, at one end of his street, was a shipyard, and they built at that time the biggest ships in the world. Right there at the end of his street, and then at the other end of town was a coal mine. So this was a very gritty, industrial, blue-collar town. It took going back there. I mean, you stop and think about it. This is a guy who spent 20 years producing music, albums with the Police, and then in a solo career and so on. Very productive. Then the creativity just went away. And he said the way he defines creativity is the ability, for him anyway, the ability to take a risk, to actually put yourself on the line and risk ridicule or being pilloried, criticized, anything along those lines. I mean, this is a quotation from him, but you have an idea that you think you want to put out there, and you must take that risk. So here he was, a fountain of creativity, and then one day it just all ended. Which it sounds like is the case, very similar or exactly the case with the novelist I was just telling you about, her situation. I bring up Sting to kind of elaborate on this, hoping that it's going to help her, because I will share this podcast with her. Even though she doesn't want to come on the show, she doesn't really want to be known. I don't think so anyway. And obviously I'm going to respect her privacy. So in the case of Sting, I mean, this went on for 8 years where the music just stopped. He's a musician, but he's a writer. He wrote lyrics, he writes lyrics, he writes music, wrote it and continues to write it. And what Sting said is that it's ironic that the landscape that he had worked, I'll actually quote it to you. This is from a interview on National Public Radio. And he says, and again I quote, "It's ironic that the landscape I'd worked so hard to escape from, and the community that I had more or less abandoned and exiled myself from, should be the very landscape, the very community I would have to return to find my missing muse. And as soon as I did that, as soon as I decided to honor the community I came from and tell their story, the songs started to come thick and fast." End quote. So that was a major triumph that Sting, after 8 years of not being able to get back to who he was, to what he was capable of, pulling that off. Now I'm hoping that the novelist I've been referring to anonymously will, find something in that story. She's probably familiar with the story. I don't know. But I bring it up not just for her sake, or I would have gone directly to her. I bring it up because there's something to be learned in that by all of us, that we might find ourselves in that situation, whether we're well known and accomplished or not. We'll run into that situation, which can be, of course, devastating, and learn something from people who have been through that before. And Sting was a very high-profile case of it. He was very public about what it took to get out of that. I'm hoping that the novelist I'm referring to will come on the program whenever this takes place for her. And I'm confident it will, because you can't be that productive for that long and then suddenly be completely out of material. I just don't think it's going to happen that way, and I hope that she'll come on the program at that point. And beyond that, just share her story widely, because it's one that everybody who is trying to do the things that she has done would want to hear. So to my would-be guest, Godspeed to you. I look forward to speaking down the road and doing it publicly and hearing your story, in its full context. One of the things that kind of bothered me about the letter she wrote is that, there's a couple phrases in here when she says, "So I'm in trouble as a writer." It's a horrible place to be, but she obviously feels that she's drowning right now. And the other phrase in here that she says, "I have to say no with a whole variety of regrets." And I'm not sure exactly what that means. And frankly, I'm not going to go back to her because I don't want to bother her. Down the road, yes, this was a very recent communication, and I don't want to become a nuisance, let me put it that way. But I do want to come back to her down the road, and hopefully what I'll end up seeing is that a new novel appears with her name on it, and then I'll know that it happened. And then maybe there's another book to be written about that whole experience. I don't know, time will tell. Stay tuned. I'll stay tuned, you stay tuned. And let's hope the best for this author, because someday I want to come back to you and say, remember that author, that female author who I spoke to you about? Well, she's here now. I'm going to give you her name and she's going to tell her story. That's what I hope is the final result of this. That's all for this episode. This is my counsel for Novelist Spotlight.